something, I'm always good with people interrupting me. It's not a problem. So my name's Art. I work at the Lexington Fair Housing Council. It says Lexington in our name, but we operate throughout Kentucky. We're a nonprofit that fights housing discrimination. We do it in a bunch of different ways. One, we do legal representation and advocacy for people who think they've been the victims of housing discrimination. We also do testing. So we'll send out people just to see if they're treated different. Black person, white person, male, female. It's part of what we do. We serve the entire state of Kentucky, and we do training and outreach. So it's a big area. There's only 5 or 6 of us on staff, but we do the best that we can. And I like to start the presentation by just asking the generic question: why do people live where they live? How do people choose the right neighborhood for them? And I'm just open. No right answer. Put in the chat, tell me, come off mute.
Proximity to, businesses and schools and stuff like that.
Yep, proximity. Price is a big one, right? Like, you got to be able to afford it. I know schools is a big one. My friends, when they're talking about buying a house, always seem to be focused on where schools are. What else we got? Family, yeah. Sometimes you want to be close to your family. Sometimes you want to be far from your family. Family can go either way. Anything else? I've heard sometimes people talk about safety, proximity to work. It's a lot of different things that can go into. Now, I want in your head to think about the city you live in, and can you think about a place that's mostly Black? Can you think about an area of town that's mostly white? Can you think of an area of town that's mostly Hispanic? Why do we think that is? Or think about Louisville if you need to. Do we have mostly Black areas in Louisville? Do you have some cities in Kentucky that are all white? Why do we think that is? Why do we have that kind of racial separation? Thoughts, ideas? Money? Yep, money's part of it, right? Because some people won. Money is part of it, but we also can control. So if you look on the screen, on the left, you'll see African-American population in Lexington. The dark areas are areas that are over 50% African-American. The really light areas are 0 to 5% African-American. You'll see on the other slide there, it's where Section 8 and public housing is in Lexington. So this is by council district. So each council district has roughly the same number of population, but you see some council districts have quite a bit of subsidized housing. It's council districts like 1, 2, 11, 4, 8, 7, and some like 10, 9, and 12 have almost no subsidized housing. But while economics have a part of it, it's not the only part. If you see on this one that has 2014, the deep purple is racial and ethnic concentration areas of poverty, concentrated areas of poverty. So it's not just poor, but this is poor and Black. That's the deep purple. So there are poor areas all throughout Lexington, but this area is specifically poor and Black. And your deep green is rich and white. So it's not just about money. There are places where we know African Americans are concentrated. And again, it maps out a lot. And then if you look, it's close to the same picture as this residential eviction rate. So the one on the right there is where evictions take place in Lexington. And your deep purple is over 100% eviction rate, which means for every rental house, every residential place that's being rented, there's 1 eviction a year, which is a staggering number. But you see in those areas, there's a lot of overlap between where people are being evicted, where there's housing instability, and where African Americans live in Lexington. This is where renter help increase came in and through 2020. Some of the same overlaps. We know COVID disproportionately impacted people of color, people with jobs that had to be where you couldn't work in the office like I could. That's where the people were affected. We see a map of school proficiency. So your light areas here are places with less school proficiency. Job access, your light areas are places with less job access. All of these maps tend to fit in the same categories. This is just an overall look at disparity in access to neighborhood opportunity in Lexington. So you'll see African-American children, when you look at school proficiency, have a big disparity from white children. Labor market engagement, job access and transit access, not so much. And again, not just Lexington. This is the city of Louisville. It's probably even more pronounced. If you look on the map on the right, that deep blue is over 50% African American. So Louisville has a really strong concentration of African American population. That West End, your red, deep red, are less than 4% African American. And then if you look on the map on the left, your eviction rates in Louisville, it looks like the same map, right? Like your green is your heavy eviction rates, your yellow, and then your red are very low eviction rates. So you're seeing a lot of housing instability where there's heavy concentration of African American population in our big cities. This is where subsidized housing is in Louisville. So again, it's mostly in that West End. It's where we put our public housing sites. You'll see this is where Section 8 is in Louisville. So again, mostly concentrated on the West End, but a little more spread out. Again, Section 8 with that idea of people would be able to disperse poverty throughout the city. People could take a voucher and go anywhere. It doesn't necessarily work like that in reality. Sometimes a lot of people are stuck staying in the same areas. So when I grew up, as I was growing up, it just seemed like that's how it always was. People were always segregated in the towns based on race. As I did this job and got to know a little bit more, it turns out that's not how it always was. Turns out it was just the opposite. Turns out that when you're talking pre-Civil War, everybody lived together. It's kind of weird, but pre-Civil War, blacks and whites all lived in the same area of town. Anybody know why? Got an explanation for that? Why was there no segregation before the Civil War? Slavery? Yeah, that's part of it. But even when you didn't have slavery, still economics, right? People had to live and work in the same spot. We didn't have the same kind of car. You weren't driving 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes to work. Everybody lived in the same area. You'd see your big mansion, but followed by little slave quarters. That's what this is. This was Waveland in Lexington. This is the antebellum house. It was built in 1845. This was the slave quarters that was nearby. In other cities, you would have big houses and then little shotgun places where people would work. Sometimes slaves, but sometimes just as a thing of employment. So again, it wasn't always set up like this. This is the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum. It's what Eastern State used to be called. 1824 was when Eastern State first came in. Eastern State, its first patient was a black female named Charity. She lived there for a while, but interestingly enough, when Eastern State was founded, blacks and whites all lived together. There was no separation. So 1824, it's built for 50 years. Blacks and whites all lived together until 1876. 1876, they decided it was no longer safe to keep and I'm using this from the terms at the time, but your lunatic black people in the same area as your lunatic white people, and they began separating them out. So again, it was segregation that didn't just naturally happen. It was stuff that happened. And I'm going to use some language from the time, but again, it is potentially triggering language. So I just want to warn people. But this is a city ordinance that Louisville put in place in 1914. An ordinance to prevent conflict and ill feeling between the white and colored races in the city of Louisville and to preserve the public peace and promote the general welfare by making reasonable provisions requiring the use of separate blocks for residences, places of abode, and place of assembly by white and colored people, respectively. So a little bit of legalese there. What does that mean? Somebody give me break that down for me. What's that say?
I think like they're basically saying that they thought that in order to protect like the peace, they needed to keep everybody separate.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Like, so they're telling the black people have to live separate from the white, and they tell you why. They say that it's to keep the public peace. That's why they put this into place. and at this, the separate but equal came in later. This wasn't really necessarily even separate but equal. This was just completely separate. There wasn't necessarily an attempt to be equal in Louisville in 1914. That stayed in for a little bit, but there was a Supreme Court case out of Louisville. And this was Buchanan versus Worley, and it hit the Supreme Court in 1917. And Buchanan's this white individual who sold his house. Charles Buchanan sells his house to William Worley. Worley's black. And he buys the property, but he can't move in. Worley's black. He can't move into the property he just bought because 8 of the 10 homes were occupied by whites. And since he's black, he's not allowed to live there under the Louisville Ordinance. Worley then comes and says to Buchanan, I'm not going to pay you for this house if I can't live there. Buchanan said, yes, you are. You signed an agreement. So this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And basically, the Kentucky Court of Appeals upheld the statute, but the Supreme Court struck down the statute, not in terms of some equal process or constitution, but basically it's a contract case at this point. And it said that the white person had the right to sell their property to the black person, but it did strike down the Louisville Ordinance. So things start going on a path still. And this is how things become mapped out in the city. So this is in Lexington. This is Kramer Avenue, Ashland Avenue. It's called the Mattill neighborhood. And this is the park. And this is what they put in when as part of the incorporation of the park. Let's see, I'll start reading here. Every building erected must cost not less than 3 times the cost of the lot, thus assuring nothing but high-class residences. No Negroes can ever own property or live in the park. No business house can be erected within its limits. No adjacent or nearby Negro settlements. So again, this park and who can live in this property, in the houses, or even nearby, was all set out when they incorporated and put in the terms of the incorporation. You see restrictive covenants and other properties throughout the cities. This was from 1226 Summit Avenue in Louisville, built in 1949, and it included this clause. This property shall never be sold, rented, leased, or occupied by any person or persons other than those wholly of the Caucasian race, have to be wholly of the Caucasian race, except household servants employed by the owners of the property may live on owner's property while in such employ. So that property built in 49 is now appraised at $700,000, but only certain people were able to buy it. Same thing, 234 Castlewood Drive in Lexington. For a period of 30 years from this date, no part of the property conveyed shall be sold or leased to any Negro or any organization or association of Negroes, nor shall any Negro be permitted to occupy said property, provided that this stipulation shall not forbid any owners or lessees from having their Negro servants remain or reside on the premises. So all these were contracts or deeds restrictions put into the property when people would buy it, determining who could and could not buy it. And that continued for a while. Then in 1948, you had a Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer. This time it's out of St. Louis. And there's a St. Louis neighborhood that had enacted a racial restrictive covenant that prevented African Americans and Asian Americans from living in the area. In 1945, the Shelleys, they were an African American family and they tried to move into the neighborhood. But Louis Kramer, who lived 10 blocks away, it's not like Louis even lived next door. Louis Kramer lives 10 blocks away and he brings suit to enforce the covenant and to prevent the Shelleys from moving in. Supreme Court at this point does not strike down these covenants. It doesn't say these are illegal. It doesn't say you can't do it. But it does say at this point that the court is not going to enforce it. So you can't go to the courts to enforce these covenants. You can still privately enforce them, but you can't use the court system to enforce them anymore. But at that point, cities had already begun changing to how they were going to look from there on. So in 1928, Louisville starts changing its street names to separate white and black addresses. So if you're ever going in downtown Louisville, you'll see Chestnut becomes River Park Drive, just all of a sudden. Madison becomes Vermont. And the idea was you wouldn't have the same addresses. You can demarcate which is the African-American area of town, which is the white area of town. You're not sharing the same street address. That kind of starts shifting. And again, that lays the bones and the skeletal structure of how the cities look. But the real changes didn't come, at least in terms of the money, until the 30s and 40s. And between 1934 and 1968, how the government really tried to push home ownership. So before 1930, if you wanted to buy a house, you pretty much had to have the whole amount. Your uncle had to die. You had to have it under the mattress. You had to be able to afford it. But in 1934, the federal government decided that they really wanted to invest in home ownership. They wanted people to be able to buy homes in the suburbs, in the areas of town. And they started what would be essentially now what we look at as like the 30-year mortgage you'd pay over time. They would structure this where they would take certain maps of the city appraisers would, and then they would say which areas would be safe risks to invest was 120 billion, where it would be safe to invest the 120 billion and where they would not invest the 120 billion. So they took red circles or red marks or red shading around the areas that were not good investments. And those were areas that had Black people living in it or Black people living nearby. And we could be talking one Black person would get the whole area turned red. The yellow was caution, greens were, those are the areas we're going to put our $120 billion. So as you see through this map, $120 billion goes throughout the United States. Less than 2% of it went to people who weren't white. Over 98% of the $120 billion went to white people in those green areas. What do you think happens to the property values in those green areas? $120 billion of investments coming in. So what does the property value do? Go up or go down? It goes up. Basically, you're putting $120 billion in. All the people want to live in the green areas. That's where the government's giving you money to invest. The money goes in, the property values go up, and it builds equity. So it's kind of how home ownership works in America. You buy a house, it becomes worth more. You're able to take out a bigger loan. You can send your kid to college. It's generational wealth building. Your kid gets a better job. They buy a bigger house. It's money and equity, and it's a wealth cycle that can continue and builds on itself. What do we think happened to the home values in the red areas where they weren't investing? In fact, they were pulling money out of those areas. Property values go up or go down? They go down. A lot of times they become foreclosed. Public housing, which originally was only for white people, but began being built. This right here is Bluegrass Aspendale in Lexington. There was an 8-foot fence, and not just any fence. You can see this fence was for real. It's got the barbed wire there, separated the Black from the white. Finally removed in 1974. But again, segregation didn't originally happen. It happened over time on purpose through government intervention. Now, from 1950 to 1980s, your Black population in the American urban cities it increases. It goes from like 6 million to 15 million. And white Americans start moving out of the cities into the suburbs. And at that time, the realtor has this code of ethics. So realtors going around helping people buy or sell have a code of ethics that says a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So realtors are help steering people to certain areas, Black people to Black areas, white people to white areas. This right here is a picture of Carl and Ann Braden. Carl and Ann Braden had friends, Andrew and Charlotte Wade. And Andrew and Charlotte Wade were Black, and they wanted to buy property in Shively. It's an all-white area of Louisville. They weren't able to get anybody to sell to them, so they got their friends Carl and Ann Braden to help them buy property there. Carl and Ann did. They helped them transfer the property. Within a week of the Wades moving in, people began throwing rocks through their windows, burning crosses, firing shots into the house. And at the end of the week, there was an explosion under their daughter's bedroom. Now, it just destroyed the house. Police were never able to catch any of the people who threw rocks, burned crosses, fired shots, or caused the explosion. But they did convict Carl Braden of sedition for helping the Black person buy property in the white area. He was convicted in 1954 and sentenced to $5,000 and 15 years in prison. Carl wound up spending at least 7 months in jail before they overturned not his personal conviction, but just the law of sedition as a whole. Between 1950 and 1960 in Louisville, what was interesting was at the time, you did have heavy concentrations of African Americans, but they were a lot of thriving areas at this point. You had pharmacists, you had doctors, you had tailors, and you had a thriving community that they would shop at their community and work within their community. But in the 50s, Louisville bulldozed through most of those areas. They had this Chestnut middle-class houses along Chestnut known as Teachers Row. They replaced it at I-64 at the 9th Street with housing projects. So basically, they pushed everything to that West End blue area that we had seen earlier. If you were an African-American pharmacist, tailor, who had some opportunity, you moved out. You moved into suburbs. You moved out into different areas. But the rest, they were funneled to the west side with 9th Street, this dividing line. losing all of the opportunity that was there before. So, kind of brings the past to the present, what we look like today. So, the National Fair Housing Alliance looked at 12 metropolitan areas, and they tested realtors who help people buy homes and figure out where they want to live. And they did a test of 12 metropolitan areas to see what percent of the time people were steered based on their race. So what percent do you all think? What percent of the time, if you were Black, were you treated different by realtors? Give me a guess.
Maybe like 50%.
It's higher. Ninety-five, pretty close. It's 87% of the time. So if you were Black, you were shown mostly Black area. If you were white, you were shown mostly white area. There were some other things too. Whites were shown about 8 properties. Blacks were only shown about 5. Blacks were required to have pre-qualification letters. Whites weren't. But the real thing I want to focus on here is just the steering, right? So basically the idea of once the communities had concentrations one way or the other, realtors just naturally would be moving people toward those and continue that. And how where you live affects the opportunities that people have. So it affects whether you have access to a payday lender or a neighborhood bank. It also affects your access to school. This right here is a map of Louisville. Everything within there is a part of the Jefferson County public school system, except that little tiny city of Anchorage right there. Anchorage has its own school system. It's completely separate from the rest of Louisville. Anchorage looks a lot different than the rest of Louisville. It's 91% white and about 1% Black. The median household income in 2019 for Anchorage was $196,000 compared to Kentucky at $52,000. The median house was $780,000 compared to Kentucky at $151,000. The general health conditions are much better in Anchorage, and people do much better in school. And it makes sense, right? Like if all the rich white kids are all together and they're not hungry and you don't have people having other issues going on with their life and everything gets well funded, and you concentrate all that in one school, that school system's going to do better. Here's a comparison in Lexington of the different schools, elementary schools, and the ones that had the highest homeless population. So in Lexington, the schools with the highest homeless population were William Wells Brown, Harrison, Deep Springs, Yates Elementary, and Mill Creek. And the 5 elementary schools with the lowest homeless population were Rosa Park, Sandersville, Maxwell, Stonewall, and Veterans Park. You see the free and reduced lunch in the top group has like 96, 95, 80%. In the bottom group, you've got some with 9 and 17%. So there's a very big difference between which has free and reduced lunch, which has hungry kids, and which has kids who are doing really well at home. The percent non-white, 83% at the top. And then at the bottom, you've got some at 15, 19. So very different racial compositions between the two. And the schools have very different performance. The bottom schools all rank in the top 5 to 10%. The other schools don't do as well. Now, an interesting thing that I did notice was sometimes we think about schools and we think about racial segregation. We think, well, it's just a matter of income, just a matter of paying. But you actually see the schools at the top, they spend more money per pupil, right? It's like $11,000, $12,000 per pupil. And the schools at the bottom only spend about $8,000 to $9,000 per pupil. So we're actually spending more money per kid at the schools that are doing less well. But the other interesting thing I did notice was like, if you look at the school average teacher years of experience, the schools at the top, those teachers are only there like 5 to 7, maybe 9 years. And the schools at the bottom have teachers who've been there 12, 14, 15, 18 years. Why do we think that is? Why do we have the disparity in teachers' years of experience? Any guesses? I don't know. I just have a few theories. Lack of resources and support. Yeah, my theory is that basically what happens is you get people out of school to teach, people out of school who want to teach, and they're brand new, and they have to take whatever's available, and they'll go to these schools with the higher homeless population that do less well in their testing. They'll teach there for their few years until they get enough experience, and then job opens and they'll move. So you're concentrating. So again, it's not a matter of like how much money we spend. It's not even a matter of student-teacher ratio, but it's a matter of where we're concentrating poverty, where we're concentrating based on race, and then the performances we're expecting. So Rosa Parks Elementary School has 9.6% free and reduced lunch. It's about 60% white. William Wells Brown has 88% free and reduced lunch and 72% African American. Rosa Parks has more students per teacher. Rosa Parks spends slightly less per kid, but you don't really expect the same results from those two schools. Rosa Parks in this, and this is an arbitrary kind of, but it tracks 7th out of 700 schools. William Wells Brown 673 out of 700 schools, because you have a bunch of free discounted lunch, kids who are in poverty, kids who've been segregated in a specific area, all concentrated in that one school. Now, talked a lot about Lexington and Louisville, but it's not just about Lexington and Louisville. This is a statewide issue. It was a 1904 criminal indictment against Berea College. So Berea College, one of the first integrated schools in the South, first integrated school in Kentucky. In fact, not only did they integrate the college, but they actually were trying to integrate the whole city of Berea. Around the school, they would have their employees checkerboard patterns in black, white houses, just to try to keep everything completely integrated. Not necessarily legal to do at this point, but that, they were very progressive thinking at the time. But in 1904, there was a criminal charge against the city of, against Berea College, and it said, the said Berea College, being a corporation duly incorporated under the laws of the state of Kentucky, and owning, maintaining, and operating a college, school, and institution of learning known as Berea College, located in the town of Berea, Madison County, Kentucky, did unlawfully and willfully permit and receive both the white and Negro races as pupils for instruction in said college, school, and institution of learning. They're found guilty. They had a fine of $1,000, went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was upheld. Anybody want to think? Let's just thinking through 1904, 1908. That goes through. What do we think that changes in the way Berea looks today versus in the past? How do you think that criminal indictment, that government action, how does that influence what Berea looks like today? Anybody have any guesses? Any thoughts? Is Berea more integrated, less integrated? What do we think? Anybody go to Berea? Actually, yeah. Berea, the school, is actually relatively integrated. How about the surrounding city? So Berea in 1900 census, 12.8%, about 13% of it, Madison County farms were black owned. So had about 13% African-American population, Berea in 1900. Berea in 2019, 87.4% white, 3.9% black. So Berea looks a lot different after this. The number of African-Americans in Berea changed drastically. Home ownership rates in Lexington. Whites are much more likely to own their home than blacks or Hispanic. So that's kind of, again, the past, but it still plays out. 1968, there was a case. Joseph Jones was an African-American, his wife Barbara, who's white, saving their money to buy a new suburban home. They toured Paddock Woods in 1965. They made an offer to purchase the house. But the guy there declined their offer, said his general policy was not to sell houses and lots of Negroes in this particular community. So when he sold homes to blacks in the white neighborhoods, he lost business. So Civil Rights Act, the Supreme Court said, well, that's illegal based on the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So at that point, they said, we've had this law in place for 100 years that would make this illegal, but we've been letting it go all that time. 1968 are when things really started significantly to change from a legal standpoint. Anybody know what happened April 4th, 1968? April 11th, 1968 is when they passed the Civil Rights Act. Anybody know what happened on April 4th, 1968? It's assassination. Wasn't Kennedy, wasn't Lincoln, wasn't Lennon. Anybody? MLK, yeah. So Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And within a week of his passing was when they passed the Civil Rights Act, partly to keep them from having civil unrest, riots. And when it was originally passed, it prohibited discrimination based on a person's race, color, religion, or national origin, right? So 1968, they're finally coming to laws. Can't discriminate based on race, color, religion, or national origin. Kentucky, around the same time, also passed their own legislation, mostly through the work of these two. The one on your left is Georgia Davis Powers. One on your right is May Street Kidd. Both had a real passion for civil rights. Georgia Davis Powers had long tried to lobby to get the state legislature to pass civil rights protection. Never had much luck, but the legislature was all split on this issue of daylight savings time. Half wanted it, half didn't. They came to Georgia Davis Powers and said, we really need your vote on daylight savings time. And Georgia Davis Powers, being the shrewd politician that she was, what did she tell them? How does politics work? What did Georgia Davis Powers say? People, you need to know this is how politics works. Important life lesson. Nobody? Okay. You do something for me and I'll do something for you. Absolutely. That's what she said. So she got them to vote with her because she voted with them. And in Kentucky, we wound up getting civil rights protection because we really wanted daylight savings time. So that was the original protections, right? Race, national origin, color, religion. Now you had to wait a little while. 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74. They went around to adding gender. And in the old days, if a woman wanted to buy a house, who knows what she had to have with her if she wanted to buy a house? What did the woman have to bring with her to buy a house? Yep, her husband. She needed her husband. She just otherwise wasn't going to be able to buy it. So 1974, we add protections for gender. And then 1988, Reagan signs into law protections for familial status and disability. So those are your basic protections in the Fair Housing Law. They covered almost anything regarding buying a house, appraisals, construction, improving, renting, brokering, all of that. And look, in my job, we still do have places where people are intentionally discriminating. And that happens throughout, right? This is United States versus Donald Sterling. He was the former owner of the Los Angeles Clippers. This was in 2009. His company had some buildings where they indicate African Americans and Hispanics weren't desirable. They ran into far fewer Hispanics and African Americans than you would expect. They wound up paying $2.725 million as compensation. You also have people who just post horrible things, maintenance, and you have people who just treat people different. But the whole point of this early part of the presentation is, I think, in my job, if I could wave a magic wand and get everybody to treat everybody else just the same, disregarding race, it wouldn't make that much difference because of everything that we already have baked into the system. That the concentration of segregation that from the past is such a big legacy that it's hard for us to undo. And I'll give you this example that I'll share from my work. I was doing a training for the New Albany Housing Authority, New Albany right across the river from Louisville. And the Housing Authority had a new director coming in. And the director came in and they have two buildings. One everybody referred to as the white building and one everybody referred to as the black building. And everybody referred to the one as the white building. It wasn't its actual name, but they referred to it as that because that's where all the white people lived. And they referred to the other as the black building because that's where all the black people lived. So as new director, put yourself in that situation, right? How do you fix that problem as a new director coming in? How do you fix the problem of segregation that's been baked in? Because we're going to assume you're not going to discriminate anymore moving forward, right? You're not going to treat people different based on their race. But the problem for this director was every time a white person came up for the black building, they're like, I don't think that's the right fit for me. I don't feel comfortable. So they wouldn't move in. Same happened when a black person came up for the white building. So give me some suggestions. How can the new director, you're the new director at the New Albany Housing Authority. How are you going to fix this pattern of segregation from the past when you take over? Give me some thoughts. Give me some ideas. Incentives, divest from the current system and integrate housing. Yeah, but so your incentives, you can't incentivize under the current laws. I can't incentivize white people to move into the black building. because they can't treat people different based on their race. Anybody have anything? Because I don't. I don't really know how you fix the problem. In fact, the only good solution that I've heard is just burn it all down and start back up. Because if you do incentives for everyone, you still have that issue where people think, well, it's so black, that area is so concentrated. It seems to me it's not the one for me. I don't feel like that's the right place. The segregation is so baked in. So in public housing in Louisville, we've got everything. And we talk about education, but I also know I have friends who are I know people who are relatively educated who, if they were black and they go to all white area, they're not going to live there. And if they're white and they go to an all black area, it is not necessarily about something where education just fixes it for people. This is Westchester. It's a relatively affluent area of New York. Westchester gets millions and millions of dollars to build affordable housing every year. Where do you think Westchester typically put their affordable housing? Did they put affordable housing in their rich white areas? Or did they put it in that, see the little red at the very bottom? They're poor black areas. Where are they putting all their affordable housing? Rich white areas, or are they putting the affordable housing in the poor black areas? They're putting in the black areas. And when they do that, when they're putting all the affordable housing in the poor black areas, are they, A, fixing the legacy of segregation, B, not making it better but not making it any worse, or C, are they actually adding to the legacy of segregation when you put all your affordable housing in the black areas? Yeah, they're adding to it, right? It's not even neutral. It is continuing. It is continuing the legacy of segregation, and it is adding to it. So I'll give you the example again, a real world example that makes it difficult figuring out how to handle and think through these things. City of Lexington traditionally gets about $2 million in affordable housing trust fund money every year. Okay, $2 million that they can put to housing. There'll probably be a little bit more with COVID relief, but $2 million typically. Where should the city put that $2 million of affordable housing money, right? Because we all know that there needs to be more affordable housing, right? And if you take that $2 million, you could put it probably in Winburn, which is a mostly African-American area in Lexington, you can maybe build 20 homes. Or you could build one house maybe next to John Calipari's house in a rich white area. What should the city do with that money, right? Because if you build the one house next to John Calipari's house, you're at least not putting affordable housing all in the black area. You're not adding to the patterns of segregation. You're not making the segregation worse. But you're also not providing the total amount of affordable housing that you could otherwise. Suggestions, thoughts? How do we handle that question? Send it to other counties, absolutely. But those other counties, they tend to be very, very, Kentucky has some very, very white counties. Kentucky is not as a whole integrated. And there's reasons for that. There's historical reasons for who is living where. And the same example, if I'm in Lee or Owsley County, how do I integrate Lee or Owsley County? How do I make it where it looks like it's an open county regardless of race, if it's already mostly white? How do I open it to different levels of tourism? How do I open it to younger generations? These are problems that most of our rural areas are trying to struggle with. How do I get it young, create generational, that people want to come? Use it for developments like grocery stores, for areas of food insecurity and green spaces. And again, the problem with grocery stores, which I don't want to get too far off of the tangent, but grocery stores are mostly managed by big corporations that are going to decide where they go. The idea of us being able to convince grocery stores to go where they have a whole matrix for deciding which places they go to. It doesn't always fit what we think necessarily is the best thing for the community. But again, so the John Calipari example, where do I put my $2 million? Here's the best I can come up with, because I don't have an answer for that question. I think both issues are legitimate. I think we do need more affordable housing. I think we do want to avoid continuing segregation legacies. But I do think the idea is we should, when we're building affordable housing, in Owsley, when we're building affordable housing in Lee County, when we're building affordable housing in Lexington, you consider all the things that we talk about, which is affordability, right? That's a big one. What can I afford to build? But you also consider safety. You consider schools. You consider all the different things in terms of location to work. You just try to put all that into play and try to balance all that to make the best choice you can in terms of where you put. Sandra wants to build a movie theater. So, maybe that helps develop areas. All right. So 1968, we talked about race, color, national origin, religion were protected. We talked about 74, how they added gender. 1988, disability and familial status. 1999, Louisville was the first one to add sexual orientation and gender identity. Louisville also in 2021 added homelessness, military service, criminal history, source of income. Different cities have different protections. So example, in DC, I can't discriminate based on political affiliation. So in DC, I can't say I'm not going to rent you because you're Republican or because you're a Democrat. So different places have different protections. Sexual orientation and gender identity are two of the biggest ones that we deal with. Louisville, again, adopted their fairness ordinance in 99. Lexington came in 99, Covington in 2003. Went for a while with none, and then tiny little town of Vico added it in 2013. How many counties do you think currently protect sexual orientation and gender identity from discrimination? Give me a guess. How many counties in Kentucky am I protected based on my sexual orientation and gender identity? 110. Yeah, it's pretty close. It's 120, right? That's how many counties we have. Every county currently does it, not because they all have fairness ordinances, but because of the Supreme Court case. So in 2020, there was a case, Bostock versus Clayton County. It has 6-2 decision, including some of the recent Trump appointees. But here's the facts. There were 3 different cases. In Clayton County, Georgia, they had fired Gerald Bostock for conduct and becoming a county employee shortly after he began participating in a recreational softball league for gay individuals. So they fired him for that. There was an Altitude Express that fired Donald Zarda days after he mentioned being gay. And RG&GR Harris Funeral Homes fired Amy Stevens, who presented as a male when she was hired. And after she informed her employer that she planned to live and work full-time as a woman, that's when they fired her. The Supreme Court case, including the Trump appointee, said because discrimination on the basis of homosexuality or transgender status requires treat different because of their sex, basically it's all gender discrimination. So all of these things, sexual orientation, gender identity, are covered under gender. You can't discriminate based on gender. So that includes homeless shelters, university dorms, student housing, rooms for rent, nursing homes. Which brings up a bunch of questions when we talk about gender. Can a university still have male and female dorms? Can a homeless shelter only allow men or women at the shelter? Can a landlord ask about an applicant's gender at all? Can a landlord let you select potential roommates based on their gender? Does a landlord have to refer to tenants by the gender they identify with? What responsibility does the landlord have if a tenant harasses another tenant on the basis of their gender expression? All of these things. Anybody have thoughts? These are all things that we will continue to address and will continue to be issues. Do you all think, can we still have men and women homeless shelters? Or is that gender discrimination? Yes, it is discrimination or it's not. Can you have a women's shelter but no men's shelter? Is that discrimination? Can I only house men but not house women? As long as they're equal? So what is that? Hey, Becky, what does that mean? Let's talk about that. What does it mean as long as they're equal? Are we treating men and women different? Is that allowed? We have a men's shelter and a women's shelter. So if you provide services to both men and women, can we do that for race? Can we have a white shelter and a Can we do it for disability? Yeah. So how come we can do it for gender? If we can't do it for the other ones, can we do it? We can't have like a national origin. We can't have the law won't let me have a Christian shelter over here and a Jewish shelter over here. So domestic violence issues, yep, those are things that we have to consider. But domestic violence issues do apply, we know, to men and women too. Yep, and then trans. Right, so this is St. Louis, Mary and Bev. They were 74 and 70, lived in St. Louis since their childhood, been in a committed relationship since 78, married on a trip to Massachusetts in 2009. 2016, they put down a deposit at a unit at Friendship Village, a continuing care retirement community in the St. Louis area. After learning of their marriage, Friendship Village rejected them, pursued to a cohabitation policy. They sued for sex discrimination. Basically, that case, they lost it until the Bostock case, and afterward they were able to reach a confident, basically they won it after the Bostock case. You couldn't reject them. The senior community couldn't reject them. There was a 2016 phone study by Center of American Progress carried out in 4 states, 100 phone calls to homeless shelters based on transgender women. There was only 30% of them were willing to house transgender women with other women. 13% were willing to house transgender women in isolation or with men. 21% refused service altogether, which is definitely going to get you in trouble. Another 21% could not answer and were unsure. Also, again, going to get you in trouble. The idea of gender is not what the idea of gender was before. These are just terms and ideas that are not a fad. You know, it's just things that are changing. The idea, look, in 40 years ago, if you were a woman who wore jeans, then you were apparently representing yourself as a male and would have been seen as such. Things do change. So terms like AMAB, AFAB, assigned male or female at birth, the difference between a gender identity, gender expression, your sexual orientation, whether or not you're transgender or trans, cisgender or cis, non-binary, agender, gender expansive, indifferent pronouns. Basically, so my advice to housing providers is you should accept the person for the gender that they present themselves as. I'm not currently aware of any shelter that actually checks, has a check on gender. We don't want to be in the business. You definitely don't want to be in the business of checking genitalia to decide whether or not somebody can qualify for your services. So all of these things. Being aware of pronouns and being allowed that they do matter. And again, from a fair housing, I'll give you the best. It's not a perfect analogy, but I'll use the analogy that I think works for most people. Let's say you're a person and you call everybody honey or baby, right? Sweetie, honey, baby. If I call somebody sweetie or honey, I'm a landlord, I call them sweetie or honey, am I going to get sued for sexual harassment? You could. Yeah. You could, but for the most part, calling somebody sweetie or honey is probably not going to get you sued, for the most part. But think about the fact pattern, though. I keep calling somebody sweetie, honey. It's just natural to me. They ask me to stop. They tell me it's making them uncomfortable. I keep doing it. Am I going to get sued? Probably not. If I apologize, say I'm sorry, didn't mean to, it's hard for me to control, just quickly apologize and move on. Probably not going to get sued still. But if I purposely keep calling somebody sweetie or honey after they ask me not to, I probably will get sued, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for that. Same thing with pronouns. If I call somebody by the wrong pronoun, am I going to get sued? No. If I call them by the wrong pronoun again after they've asked me, but I explain it was a mistake and I try to do my best, am I going to get sued? Probably not. Again, anybody can get sued. I'm talking about whether or not you're going to lose and pay money. But if I'm intentionally calling somebody by the wrong pronoun over and over, am I harassing them based on gender? Yeah, I probably am. And then you probably are going to get in trouble. Any thoughts, questions on that? I've done a lot of presentations, some for like maintenance people, rural maintenance people and housing authority, and some of them react really strongly to this, right? Like they have a very specific religious calling, they think, that makes it very difficult for them to operate. And I understand that, but if you're going to be in the business of providing housing in a public, right, in a public way, right, either through private market or through the government, either way, but you're providing housing to the public, you can't let your religion dictate who you can and can't provide housing to. If I'm a Christian and I don't really agree with somebody's Jewish beliefs, I can't refuse to provide housing to them. That's just not what the law allows. If I'm Jewish and I can't keep out Christians because they don't practice or they do things differently than I do. It's just where the law says, because the idea is that we're supposed to all have the same access to the public and live in a communal world. Any other thoughts on gender status, sexual orientation, or how things progress and change over time? All right, some of the other stuff we see that's different. So we see a lot of sex and gender discriminations, and basically we see it in two different ways. We see a lot of domestic violence issues, and basically under the law, a landlord can't refuse to rent to you because you're a victim of domestic violence, and also can't evict you because you're the victim of domestic violence. Sometimes we'll see landlords who the cops will be called, there will be a domestic incident, they'll try to evict everybody. Basically, the landlord should not be trying to evict the person who's just a survivor. They can evict the perpetrator, but they shouldn't be evicting somebody because they're a survivor. They also sometimes will have to let survivors out of leases so that they can find safe places to move. We deal with that quite a bit. The other thing we deal with is quite a few sexual harassment cases can take the form of quid pro quo, just basically something for nothing, asking something for something else, sexual favors in order to provide housing. In our business, we see this typically a lot of times with people who are women who are very vulnerable, who have been in homeless, and we typically see it in older men, usually like 60s, 70s, who will try to use their position of having housing and hold that over the person. We also see that sometimes in hostile environment, can include unwanted sexual advances, remarks, gestures. I have tenants who've woken up with the landlord while they're sleeping. Landlord's just right there by their bed in their bedroom. Landlord who gives them flowers. Landlords who touch them inappropriately. It's not at all that unusual in today's world. Those are things we help with. If anybody's aware of those type of issues, those are ones we very much want to try to stamp out. Usually it's not just the one person who's been affected. When landlords do these type of things, it's usually something that they've done over and over again. Feel they can get away with it. Other things, so we talked about sexual orientation, gender identity. Louisville, again, added veterans, homelessness, criminal background, and source of income. So all of those are protected in Louisville. So basically in Louisville, they can't refuse to rent to you or treat you different just because you are homeless, because you served in the military, or because you have a Section 8 voucher or other types of income. They can't treat you different because of that. Or even arrest history. So a person should never be treated differently just because they were arrested for something. In our system, arrest does not mean that you've done anything wrong. They can sometimes treat you different for a conviction, and this isn't just in Louisville, in any place. If a landlord's going to keep you out for your conviction history, it's got to be something relevant to whether or not somebody's going to be a good tenant. So again, an arson from a couple of months ago is probably relevant whether or not you're a good tenant. So that's something the landlord could realistically consider. A fact that a person had a marijuana charge from 20 years ago is not statistically relevant to how well they'll be as a tenant. And that's not something that landlord should be considering. Any questions about that? It's just blanket rules against any kind of crime probably will get a landlord in trouble. Okay, so I'll spend the rest of my part talking about disability. So typically when you think about discrimination, you think about race. It's what I spent almost all of this presentation talking about so far, but it's not the number one complaint I get. By far, we get many more disability complaints than anything else. That's the number one driver of discrimination, civil rights, housing work. Anybody want to guess why I get so many more disability cases than anything else? It's like 3 times more in race, a lot more than gender or familial status. Why do we get so many disability cases? Not ADA compliant. So basically, there's 2 real reasons, I think. One is just Kentucky, the nation as a whole, but Kentucky has a lot of individuals with disabilities. So that's part of it. The other part is the accommodation issue Hannah brings up. Yes, so in everything else, it's all about treating people the same, but accommodations means sometimes you have to treat people different. So I'll give you this example. You're a landlord, this is your apartment complex. You have 2-story office, 2-story housing, no elevator. You've got an individual who comes up and wants to rent something. She's in a wheelchair, and all you have available is something on the 2nd floor. What do you tell them? What do you tell the person who's trying to rent from you? What are we going to tell them? Any ideas? Any thoughts? All I've got available is something on the 2nd floor. What am I going to tell them? We have a unit on the 2nd floor. I see you use a wheelchair, and we unfortunately don't have elevator. Well, right. So the first rule is we're going to treat everybody the same. So we are going to say, here's what's available. I'm not going to tell her I don't have anything available, right? I'm going to say, here's what's available. And then she can make her own decision about whether or not to rent it. I have had clients multiple times who are in wheelchairs, who have rented 2nd floor units and who have gone up and down stairs in rain and snow because that's the only place they've had to live. They've just done what they've had to get by. So rule number 1 is treat everybody the same. But here's where it gets a little tricky. She's been there a couple of months on that 2nd floor, and then the bottom floor opens up. Now, normally my rule, we've got a rule, and this is a rule for everybody, you can't move in the middle of a lease. And then when you do move, we charge you a transfer fee. She wants to move immediately, and she doesn't want to pay the transfer fee. Am I going to treat her the same as everybody? What am I going to do here? No, because she needs the 1st floor. Right. So I'm going to make an accommodation. I'm not going to charge her for it. And the idea isn't so much that she gets any kind of special rights. The idea is just that we're trying to provide her with the same opportunities to live in this apartment complex that anybody else would have. So we have to make what's called a reasonable accommodation, let her move in. All right. Same example. Woman's in a wheelchair. I've got a no pet policy, and she wants to have her cat. Do I have to let her have the cat? No. She says it's because she needs it because of her disability. If she can provide documentation. That's right. So basically, the tenant would have to show a few things. 1, the tenant has to request the accommodation, right? So if the tenant was on the 2nd floor and never asked for anything, I don't have to move her. But if she has to be moved, then I have to make an accommodation. They have to have a disability in order to get an accommodation, right? It can't just be, I kind of miss my cat. It has to be a disability. So something that substantially interferes with major life activities, the way it's defined. What she asked for has to be related. So when she's in a wheelchair and she has to be moved to a ground floor unit, it's pretty easy to see the relation between the disability and the request. She's in a wheelchair and she needs a cat. I can't necessarily see the relation. So she's going to have some kind of proof, probably, or documentation from a doctor, a social worker, or somebody saying why that she's disabled and that she needs the cat. And then whatever they ask for has to be reasonable. So 1 cat's probably going to be reasonable. A bunch of cats, I don't know, maybe not. It has become the bane of my existence, though. We deal with a bunch of support animal cases. And look, I mean, the truth of the matter is we have, as a society, more and more people living with more and more significant mental illness, more and more anxiety, more and more depression, and more work for, and more suicides, too. So it is something that people are very aware of, and we try to make accommodations. Now, this applies to shelters. Shelters are housing providers. They have to allow for support animals too. But again, they have to have proper documentation. There's a little difference between service animals too. Service animals are usually like the seeing eye dog, what you can take in Target or the mall. Support animals are just what you might need for emotional support, what you can have in the home or the place where you're dwelling. But you can't charge extra fees and you can't have breed restrictions. You can't have weight restrictions for those. Any other questions on sport animals? Again, it's probably what I deal with more than anything else. Other kind of accommodations we'll get. Parking spaces, live-in aids, caregivers, letting tenants out for disability-related reasons, individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. Again, you'll have to work with them, try to accommodate their needs, those type of things. All right. Any questions? Any other thoughts, concerns, issues? Here's my contact information. Always feel free to contact us. Be happy to try to talk through issues, or if you have clients going through these kind of things, we'd love to try to be able to help. I think that's it for me.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. Adrian talked very highly of it, and so we were really happy that you agreed to talk to our AmeriCorps members about these issues that are still happening, as you know. That's it. I'm going to share my screen, and thank you again, Art. If anyone has any questions after you hop off, I'll be sure to kind of send them your way if that happens.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Bear with me for just a sec. I've got to pull up. I just have a few quick things that I want to talk about, and then we will wrap up, but just bear with me for a second. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thanks. Last time I tried, for some reason, it wouldn't share. So can you still see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. This is just a reminder for our AmeriCorps Direct Service members. If you have any new households that you served in the month of November, get those sent over to me through email, or you can mail them or take pictures. And the same for volunteer forms. This is not for our VISTA members. This is just for our AmeriCorps Direct Service members. This is just a quick reminder. If you served any new households or individuals from November, get them sent over to us. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So last month when we did our monthly member training, we talked about Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So this is not an observed holiday. All AmeriCorps members and programs are serving on this day. It is January 16th. So you can go ahead and make note that we will not have a monthly member training on January 16th because we are going to be out and about doing things in our communities. We are coordinating a project in Lexington. So it is open for any AmeriCorps member, direct service, or Vista, we would love to have you join us. We have reserved a room at YMCA in downtown Lexington. We are going to be assembling care kits to be distributed throughout our communities across the state, depending on where you are traveling from. Basically, if this is something that you are wanting to do, so if you are not in Central Kentucky and you want to travel that day, that morning, and join us, I need you to email me and Caitlin to let us know that you are planning on participating with us. Once we kind of get an idea of who from, say if somebody from Ashland or somebody from Paducah wants, or Henderson or wherever, and they're traveling down, we will send out a message to everyone, kind of giving down the plans that we are, what we're going to be doing. But
Hey,
if you
Holly.
are,
Hi, it's Meredith. So we're coming for Martin Luther King Day to Lexington.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Okay, so is that you, Aria, Carissa, Raven?
Me,
Or do you need
Aria, and Carissa is a definite yes. We do not
Okay.
know about Raven or Hannah yet.
Okay. Great.
So,
All right.
but
Thank
we're for
you.
sure coming.
Great. Okay. I'm writing your all's name down, so that's why I just kind of stopped talking. Cool. So anyone else, if you want to join us, we want the more the merrier. We'll send out once we kind of get an idea. Hopefully by the end of next week or sometime next week, you can let me know or Caitlin know. I will send out a recap email tomorrow, just kind of summarizing the reminders that we talked about today, and also with the recording. But yeah, we're going to be putting care kits together in the morning at the YMCA. And then following that, we will be attending the MLK Day March through downtown Lexington and then the program. So the march lasts about an hour. Well, not really an hour, but probably close to that. And then the program will start at 2 p.m. And then once that is over, then you and everyone else and us will travel back home. So if this is something that you are interested in doing, just let us know. If not, we do expect you to either participate in a project that is happening in your area, or we can help figure out, and I don't know, kind of scope out a project that might be happening in your county or closer to you, or you can create your own project that you would like to do. So there are some options, but we are doing that in Lexington and it's going to be fun and we would love to see everyone. Just a quick reminder about holidays. So we do know that Christmas does fall on the weekend. We know that that's not the only holiday that people celebrate. So please just make sure that you are communicating that with your supervisors. We want everybody to have off for their winter holidays. So figure that out with your supervisor. If you need alternate days off, we will observe Friday, December 23rd as a day off, and Monday, December 26th off. That's for both programs, AmeriCorps Direct and our Vista program. If you need to take additional time off, then you would use your personal days to do so. And if you need to talk to us, separately that we can talk about that too. But just a quick reminder about that. And I forgot to put New Year's too, but New Year's is basically the same. It is the Friday. Oh, what day is that? The 30th, I do believe. Yeah. So then following that week for the New Year holiday, you will observe Friday off and January 2nd off as well. Shortly after the holidays, taxes will be, we'll send out W-2s shortly after that. We have until January 31st to get those sent out. We will be doing that electronically this year. This is our first year doing that. Typically they are mailed through the post office, but this year they will be sent electronically. We will use the email that we have on file that you receive your pay stubs to, or that your pay stubs are sent to. So if you would like or prefer your W-2 to be sent to a different email, you need to let us know by December 30th so that we can let our director of finance know and get that list sent to her. Vista members, please make sure that your address is up to date in your My AmeriCorps portal. So where you applied, where you completed your oath, make sure your mailing address is up to date. Our office does not send out your W-2s. They are sent out from the Federal AmeriCorps agency. So whatever address you have on file is where it will be sent to. So please just make sure that's up to date so that you don't have any delays receiving your W-2. And does anybody have any questions? Okay, Crystal will be there. Crystal, no, that's a good question. Do we need to do a wrap-up form if the person isn't housed? No. You only complete the wrap-up form if the person has either maintained their housing or they move into permanent housing. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you all for hopping on today's call. I hope you found it informative. And like I said, tomorrow I will send out a summary email with the YouTube link in case you hopped on a little later and wanted to watch or rewatch. It will be available to you all. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all. Thanks for everything you all do. All right. We'll talk to you soon.